The Gathering Storm in Budapest. From the archival records, specifically the vellum-bound diaries of the subject, the story begins not in the clamor of war but in the cultured quiet of a Budapest apartment. The year is 1938. The world of 17-year-old Hannah Szenes, known to history as Hannah, is one of literature, theater, and intellectual discourse. Her father, Béla Szenes, was a celebrated playwright and author, and though he had passed away years earlier, his legacy imbued their assimilated, upper-middle-class Jewish household with a deep love for the Hungarian language and arts. An entry from her diary, dated October 27, 1938, reveals a mind grappling not with geopolitics, but with youthful ambition. I don't know whether I've already mentioned that I've been elected to the Literary Society's Executive Committee. This means a great deal to me. I feel I am on the right path, but I wonder, will I be a writer? It is my only true desire. This was a world of privilege and security, a fragile bubble of Magyar Jewish identity that believed itself to be an integral, protected part of the nation's fabric. This illusion, however, was being systematically dismantled. The analysis of this period requires understanding the specific nature of Hungarian anti-Semitism. It was not yet the genocidal fury of the SS, but a creeping, legalistic poison. The 1920 numerus clausus law had already limited Jewish university enrollment. Now, under the regency of Admiral Miklos Horthy, whose government was increasingly tethered to Nazi Germany for political and economic favor, a series of more draconian Jewish laws were being enacted. These laws systematically stripped Jews of their rights, professions, and property. The archival documents from this time, government decrees, newspaper editorials, show a society slowly being conditioned to see its Jewish population as an alien other. For Hannah, this was not an abstract political development. It manifested in the sting of exclusion at her prestigious Protestant private school, where her literary talents were suddenly overshadowed by her Jewishness. A pivotal moment, documented in her writings, was her exclusion from a school literary society leadership position due to her faith. This personal slight was a microcosm of a national betrayal. It forced upon her a profound realization: her Hungarian identity was conditional, her safety a mirage. It was this disillusionment that ignited a new fire within her, a force that would steer her away from the literary salons of Budapest and towards a destiny she could not yet imagine. The poet's soul was beginning to forge a warrior's resolve. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. A new dawn in Palestine. The decision was made. If Hungary no longer wanted her as a daughter, she would find a new motherland. Her diary entries from late 1938 and 1939 are electric with a newfound purpose: Zionism. This was not merely a political ideology. For Hannah, it was an escape and a calling, a complete spiritual and personal reinvention. "I've become a Zionist," she wrote with the fervor of a convert on her 18th birthday. "This word means more to me than I can say. I feel that I am now a Jew in the truest sense of the word." In September 1939, just as the Wehrmacht stormed into Poland and plunged the continent into war, Hannah Szenes boarded a ship bound for British-Mandate Palestine. Our archival footage of the port of Haifa from this era shows the stark contrast she would have witnessed: the ancient, sun-baked hills meeting the modern cranes of a port bustling with hopeful, often desperate, immigrants. This was the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish community, a laboratory of nation-building. Her destination was the Nahal Girls' Agricultural School, a crucible of the Zionist pioneering ideal. Here, the soft hands of a Budapest intellectual were plunged into the unforgiving soil. Tactical analysis of the Yishuv's strategy reveals the critical importance of such institutions. They were not just schools, they were training centers for a new type of Jew, one who was self-sufficient, physically robust, and tied to the land. The curriculum was a blend of agricultural science, physical labor, and Hebrew language immersion. Logistical records show students rising before dawn for backbreaking work in the fields and dairies, followed by hours of study. For Hannah, this was a profound shock. A letter to her mother, Catalin, preserved in our files, speaks of aching muscles and exhaustion, but also of a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction. She was no longer just a mind, she was part of a physical, collective effort to build a nation from scratch. The technology was rudimentary, hand plows, simple irrigation, but the human factor was extraordinary. She was surrounded by young women from across Europe, all of whom had fled the rising tide of fascism. They were a self-selected group of idealists, and in their company, Hannah's own resolve hardened. She was learning to endure, to work as part of a team, and to see her life not as an individual pursuit, but as a component in a larger historical struggle. Whispers of annihilation. In 1941, having completed her agricultural training, Hannah Szenes achieved a core ambition of the Zionist pioneer. She became a member of a kibbutz. She joined Stat Yam, a new settlement perilously located on the Mediterranean coast near the ancient Roman ruins of Caesarea. The choice was characteristic. It was a young, struggling community, a frontier post of the Yishuv. Archival photographs show a cluster of simple wooden buildings and tents against a vast expanse of sand and sea. Here, life was communal and austere. Days were spent fishing, farming, and standing guard. Yet, as her poetry from this period reveals, it was also a time of profound beauty and camaraderie. One poem, At Caesarea, later became a famous Israeli song, Eli, Eli, Shiloh Yigamer El Olam, my God, may it never end, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. This verse captures the duality of her existence, the sublime peace of her new home set against a growing, unspoken dread. For by 1942, the whispers from Europe had become a scream. Letters from home grew infrequent, their language guarded and coded. Reports from the few refugees who managed to escape spoke of ghettos, mass deportations, and something so monstrous it was almost unbelievable, systematic extermination. The economic and logistical context is crucial here. The British, engaged in a global war, controlled the flow of information and immigration. Official news was sparse and heavily censored. The Yishuv was in a state of agonizing uncertainty, piecing together a mosaic of horror from fragmented reports and rumors. For Hannah, this was an unbearable torment. Her mother, the person she loved most in the world, was in Budapest, directly in the path of the Nazi war machine. Her diary entry from that year is a historical artifact of profound importance, a declaration of intent that would seal her fate. I am suddenly struck by the idea of going to Hungary, she wrote. I feel I have to be there, to help organize youth immigration, and to bring my mother out. This was not a passing thought. It was a crystallization of her entire life's trajectory, the poet's empathy, the pioneer's resilience, and the daughter's love, all fused into a single, terrifying purpose. The peace of Stat Yam had become a gilded cage, and she knew she had to break out. For by 1942, the whispers from Europe had become a scream. Letters from home grew infrequent, their language guarded and coded. Reports from the few refugees who managed to escape spoke of ghettos, mass deportations, and something so monstrous it was almost unbelievable, systematic extermination. The economic and logistical context is crucial here. The British, engaged in a global war, controlled the flow of information and immigration. Official news was sparse and heavily censored. The Yishuv was in a state of agonizing uncertainty, piecing together a mosaic of horror from fragmented reports and rumors. For Hannah, this was an unbearable torment. Her mother, the person she loved most in the world, was in Budapest, directly in the path of the Nazi war machine. Her diary entry from that year is a historical artifact of profound importance, a declaration of intent that would seal her fate. I am suddenly struck by the idea of going to Hungary, she wrote. I feel I have to be there, to help organize youth immigration, and to bring my mother out. This was not a passing thought. It was a crystallization of her entire life's trajectory, the poet's empathy, the pioneer's resilience, and the daughter's love, all fused into a single, terrifying purpose. The peace of Stat Yam had become a gilded cage, and she knew she had to break out. The unlikely recruit. The opportunity arrived cloaked in secrecy. In late 1942, representatives of the Haganah, the Yishuv's underground military organization, began quietly approaching members of various kibbutzim. They were looking for a very specific type of person, young, idealistic, physically fit, and, most importantly, a native speaker of a European language from an enemy or occupied nation. This recruitment drive was the genesis of one of the war's most audacious and desperate operations. Our analysis of declassified SOE and Haganah documents reveals a convergence of interests. The British Special Operations Executive, whose mandate from Winston Churchill was to set Europe ablaze, needed agents who could seamlessly infiltrate hostile territory, gather intelligence, and link up with local resistance movements. The Jewish Agency, on the other hand, had a singular, desperate goal: to establish contact with the doomed Jewish communities of Europe, to offer some form of aid, and to prove to the world, and to themselves, that they were not standing by idly. Hannah Szenes was a perfect candidate. She was a native Hungarian speaker who could pass as a local. Her life on the kibbutz had made her physically tough. Her diary and poems revealed an iron will and a profound sense of duty. When the Haganah approached her, she accepted immediately. A biographical analysis shows a young woman who had been waiting for this exact call. Her personal mission, to save her mother, now aligned with a larger, military one. She and the other recruits were handed over to British officers. The transition was jarring. They were taken from the informal, egalitarian world of the kibbutz and thrust into the rigid, hierarchical structure of the British military. They were no longer pioneers, they were now designated assets, cogs in the vast machinery of Allied intelligence. To their British handlers, they were brave but ultimately expendable resources, a high-risk, high-reward gamble. To the Yishuv, they were emissaries of hope, a symbolic fist raised against the darkness. For Hannah herself, it was the ultimate test of the conviction she had forged in the fields of Nahalal and on the shores of Sdot Yam. Forging a weapon in the Egyptian desert. The transformation from poet to paratrooper took place under the blistering sun of Egypt in the winter of 1943. Hannah and her fellow volunteers were flown to a secret SOE training camp, Ramat David, and others near Cairo. Here, the last vestiges of their civilian lives were systematically stripped away. The curriculum was brutal and efficient, a masterclass in the dark arts of clandestine warfare. Analysis of the SOE training doctrine of the period shows a focus on utter self-reliance. Recruits were taught to kill silently with a Fairburn Sykes fighting knife, to handle explosives for railway sabotage, to master the intricate art of disguise and forgery, and to navigate by the stars. The human factor was paramount. Instructors pushed them to their physical and psychological limits, seeking to identify the breaking point of each operative before they were sent into the field. The most critical piece of technology they had to master was the wireless radio set. These were cumbersome, suitcase-sized devices, often the Type A Mk3 or B Mk2, B2, that were their only link back to Allied command. Training was relentless. Hannah, the poet who once filled notebooks with verse, now spent hours tapping out Morse code, her fingers learning a new, staccato language. She had to master complex ciphers and one-time pads, systems designed to be unbreakable but which required absolute precision under extreme duress. An intercepted signal or a captured codebook meant certain death not only for the agent but for the entire network. Parachute training was the final, terrifying hurdle. From the rattling fuselage of a Handley Page Halifax bomber, they learned to leap into the void. This act was both a practical necessity and a powerful psychological threshold. Surviving the jump was surviving the entry into a new, lethal reality. In her letters and poems from this period, which serve as priceless archival intelligence on the mindset of an SOE agent, Hannah's internal struggle is palpable. She writes of fear and loneliness, but also of a crystalline sense of purpose. One poem from this time concludes, "Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame." The girl from Budapest was gone. The pioneer from Sdot Yam was gone. In their place stood a volunteer in the British Women's Auxiliary Air Force, an instrument of war, waiting for the command to fall from the sky. The Gilded Cage of Cairo. Following their intensive training, Hannah Szenes and her comrades did not immediately leap into the darkened skies of Europe. Instead, they were moved to a holding pattern in Cairo, a city teeming with spies, diplomats, and military brass from every Allied nation. This period, stretching through late 1943 and into early 1944, was a unique form of psychological torture. They were honed weapons locked in an armory, their skills sharpened to a razor's edge while the clock for European Jewry ticked relentlessly toward midnight. An entry in her diary from this time, a record of profound frustration, reads, "The days pass in nerve-wracking, useless waiting. We are caught in a vicious circle, and I see no way out." A deep analytical dive into the strategic situation of the time reveals the cause of this delay. The Allied High Command, particularly the British, viewed the Balkans as a chaotic but secondary theater. Their primary focus was the upcoming invasion of Italy and the preparations for overlord in France. The SOE's Balkan operations were mired in political complexity. Agents had to navigate the treacherous rivalries between Tito's communist partisans and Mihailovic's royalist Chetniks in Yugoslavia. The British, pragmatic to a fault, would not risk dropping valuable assets until they had a stable and reliable reception on the ground. For Hannah, this strategic rationale was intolerable. Every day spent in the cafes of Cairo was a day her mother, Catalin, remained in the tightening grip of Horthy's pro-Nazi regime in Hungary. The mission, as conceived by the Jewish Agency, was one of urgent rescue. As viewed by the SOE, it was primarily an intelligence gathering and liaison operation. This fundamental conflict of objectives created a chasm of frustration. The volunteers were officially soldiers in the British Army, subject to its orders, yet their hearts were driven by a purpose the military command could not fully share. Our archives contain records of their repeated, desperate pleas to their handlers to expedite the mission. They studied maps of Hungarian railway lines, memorized the layouts of cities, and practiced their cover stories until they were second nature, all while feeling like actors rehearsing for a play that might never be staged. This period of waiting served a grim purpose. It winnowed out the wavering, solidifying the resolve of those, like Hannah, whose commitment was absolute. She was no longer just fighting for an ideal, she was in a race against time for a single, cherished life. Mission Go, the Yugoslav Detour. On March 11, 1944, the order finally came. It was abrupt, the culmination of months of tense anticipation. But the destination was not the flat plains of Hungary as they had hoped. Instead, the operational plan dictated a two-stage infiltration. They would first parachute into the mountains of Croatia, a region largely controlled by Tito's partisans, and from there, attempt a clandestine border crossing into southern Hungary. From a tactical standpoint, this was classic SOE doctrine. A blind drop directly into Hungary, a nation still allied with Germany and possessing a brutally efficient internal security service, was deemed too risky. Yugoslavia, by contrast, offered a reception committee of battle-hardened allies who could provide shelter, intelligence, and a staging area. The technology of the era necessitated this. Without secure ground support to guide them, night drops were notoriously inaccurate, and the risk of the team being scattered and immediately captured was unacceptably high. The final hours before departure were a flurry of methodical preparation, a ritual designed to ward off fear. Hannah and her comrades, Yoel Palgi, Peretz Goldstein, and others in their mission group, were stripped of all personal effects. They donned their uniforms, checked their equipment packs containing explosives, currency, and forged documents, and received their most intimate and terrifying piece of kit, the L-pill, L for lethal, a small cyanide capsule to be used in the event of capture to avoid torture and the betrayal of the mission. Analysis of SOE field manuals shows this was standard procedure, a grim acknowledgement of the stakes. The psychological weight of carrying one's own death was immense. As they boarded the unheated Handley Page Halifax bomber at an airfield in Bari, Italy, the mood was not one of heroic fervor, but of quiet, grim determination. Hannah, now designated aircraft woman second-class Hannah Szenes of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, was outwardly a British soldier. But her final poem, written just before the mission and left with a comrade, revealed her true heart. Titled "Blessed is the Match," its final lines were a self-eulogy and a declaration of sacrifice. Blessed is the heart with strength to stop its beating for honor's sake, / blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. The leap into darkness. The flight north across the Adriatic and into the Dinaric Alps on the night of March 13, 1944, was an ordeal of sensory deprivation and heightened tension. The interior of the Halifax bomber was a cavern of vibrating metal, the air thick with the smell of engine oil and cold sweat. Below, the mountains of occupied Yugoslavia were a black, unreadable mass. Our archival flight logs for SOE sorties of this nature detail the complex navigational challenges. Pilots flew low to avoid German radar, relying on dead reckoning and visual confirmation of geographic features in the fleeting moonlight, a river bend, a distinctive peak. Inside, the operatives sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The dispatcher's call to stand by was a jolt of adrenaline. They clipped their static lines, long canvas straps attached to a cable running the length of the fuselage, to the anchor line. This piece of equipment was the key to a successful low-altitude jump. It would automatically pull the ripcord as the paratrooper exited the aircraft, ensuring the canopy opened quickly. When the green light flashed and the dispatcher yelled go, there was no time for hesitation. Hannah shuffled to the open door and pushed herself into the roaring chaos of the slipstream. The initial shock was violent, a physical assault of wind and noise. Then, a brutal jerk as the static line deployed the parachute, and a sudden, profound silence, the roar of the engines replaced by the whisper of wind through the silk canopy. Below her was absolute blackness. The tactical reality of a wartime parachute drop was one of controlled chaos. The target was a small landing zone marked by partisan bonfires, but even a slight miscalculation by the pilot or a shift in the wind could scatter the team over miles of hostile terrain. Her descent was swift. The landing was not a gentle touch, but a jarring collision with the earth. She hit the ground hard, rolling to dissipate the impact as she had been trained, her body bruised but intact. The first priority, drilled into her for months, was to collapse and hide the parachute. A large sheet of white silk was a beacon to enemy patrols. Lying in the snow-dusted forest, heart-pounding, every rustle of leaves a potential threat, Hannah Szenes was now an alien presence in Fortress Europe. The poet had landed. Among the partisans. The immediate aftermath of the jump was a disorienting struggle for survival. Alone in the darkness, Hannah's first task was to find the others. Using a prearranged signal, likely a bird call or a coded whistle, she eventually made contact with Yoel Palji and the rest of her team. Their relief was immense, but they were still exposed and vulnerable. Soon, figures emerged from the dense woods. These were not the smartly uniformed soldiers of the British Army, but the Yugoslav partisans of Marshal Tito. Our historical analysis, supported by photographs and eyewitness accounts, paints a vivid picture of these fighters. They were a ragged but formidable force, men and women of all ages, clad in a motley collection of captured German and Italian uniforms, civilian clothes, and British battle dress. Their unifying feature was the red star sewn onto their caps and a look of hardened resolve in their eyes. Their primary weapon was the German Kar 98K rifle, supplemented with MP-40 submachine guns and other captured Axis equipment, a testament to their logistical reality. They fought almost exclusively with what they could take from the enemy. The meeting was a collision of worlds. The Palestinian Jews, trained by the British and driven by a Zionist imperative, were now guests of a fiercely independent, communist-led guerrilla army. The partisans' primary goal was the liberation of their country and the establishment of a socialist state. The rescue of Jews, while viewed sympathetically, was not their strategic priority. Trust had to be earned. The SOE agents had to prove their bona fides, producing coded letters and authenticating themselves via wireless contact with the SOE mission already attached to Tito's headquarters. For Hannah, this was her first immersion in the brutal reality of the front lines. She was in a war zone where the lines were fluid, where a village held by partisans one day could be the site of a brutal German anti-partisan operation the next. She and her team were escorted to a command post deep in the forest, a world of makeshift shelters, constant guard duty, and the ever-present threat of discovery. They had successfully infiltrated enemy territory, but their true destination, Hungary, remained a distant, heavily guarded frontier. The frustrating wait and the fateful news. The weeks that followed the jump turned into an agonizing 2 months of waiting in the partisan-held territory of Croatia. While they had successfully linked up with their allies, the operational plan hit a wall. The border between Croatia and Hungary was heavily patrolled by both German troops and Hungarian border guards. Crossing it would be a feat of extreme danger, requiring local guides and a perfect opportunity that never seemed to arrive. For Hannah, this limbo was excruciating. She had trained for a specific mission, and now she was an observer in someone else's war. She did not remain idle. Drawing on her agricultural and medical training, she made herself useful, tending to the wounded in the partisans' primitive field hospitals, assisting with camp duties, and all the while studying her maps of Hungary, her gaze fixed on the north. This period provides a crucial biographical insight, her resilience and adaptability. She was not merely a soldier waiting for orders, but a pioneer capable of contributing in any circumstance. Then, on March 19, 1944, catastrophic news arrived, likely crackling over a partisan radio receiver tuned to the BBC World Service. Germany, frustrated with Admiral Horthy's secret attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies, had launched Operation Margarethi. The Wehrmacht had invaded and occupied Hungary, its only remaining wavering ally. Within hours, the Gestapo and Adolf Eichmann's Sondereinsatzkommando were in Budapest, setting up their headquarters at the Hotel Majestic. The systematic ghettoization and deportation of the Hungarian Jews, the last large, intact Jewish community in Europe, was about to begin with terrifying speed and efficiency. The entire strategic and personal calculus of Hannah's mission had changed in an instant. The risk had escalated from high to near certain death. Her mother was no longer living under a hostile but semi-autonomous government. She was now under the direct, genocidal authority of the SS. For Hannah, any further delay was unthinkable. The mission was no longer a strategic choice, it was a moral and personal imperative of the highest order. She had to cross that border, and she had to do it now. The irrevocable decision. The news of the German occupation of Hungary landed like a mortar shell in the partisan camp. For the British SOE command back in Bari, the operational landscape had been fundamentally altered. A mission that was already high risk was now viewed as bordering on suicidal. Declassified signal traffic from this period indicates a shift in tone. The British officers attached to the partisans strongly advised against attempting the border crossing. Their analysis was cold and tactical. The border was now sealed not just by Hungarian patrols but by elite German army and SS units. Intelligence networks had been compromised. A lone agent, or even a small group, would be walking into a dragnet. The official recommendation, transmitted via wireless, was to abort the Hungarian leg of the mission and remain with the partisans, conducting intelligence and sabotage operations in the relative safety of the Croatian mountains. For Joel Palgi and the other male members of the team, this was a bitter but logical order. They were soldiers, and the military calculus was clear. For Hannah, it was an impossible command. The invasion had transformed her abstract mission into a concrete, desperate race to save her mother, Catalin. The archival accounts of this moment, primarily from Palgi's post-war memoirs, describe a tense and emotional confrontation. Hannah argued with a fiery, unshakable conviction. "If we don't go now, it will be too late," she insisted. What was the point of all this if we stop at the last hurdle? Her personal and biographical motivations completely overrode the military logic. She saw the order to stand down not as a strategic reassessment but as an abandonment of their core purpose. She announced her intention to proceed alone if necessary. This was a direct breach of military discipline, but it stemmed from a moral certainty that transcended protocol. Faced with her absolute resolve, and unwilling to let her go alone, 3 male comrades, Amram Goldstein, Reuven Daphne, and Johnny Freund, agreed to attempt the crossing with her, while the senior members of the team, including Palgi, reluctantly adhered to the SOE's command to remain. It was a schism born of desperation, a fateful decision that sent Hannah walking toward her destiny. The crossing. On June 7, 1944, the day after the Allied D-Day landings in Normandy, an event that felt a world away, Hannah Szenes and her small, breakaway group began their final approach to the Hungarian border near the Drava River. They were guided by two local partisans, men who knew the secret paths through the forests and marshes that even the Germans could not effectively patrol. The technological aspect of this phase was non-existent. It was a return to the most ancient form of clandestine movement, relying on terrain, stealth, and human knowledge. Their equipment was minimal: forged papers, civilian clothes worn under their uniforms, a small amount of currency, and the British-made wireless radio set, their most vital and most dangerous possession. This suitcase-sized radio was the primary reason for their mission from the British perspective. Its capture would not only confirm their status as spies but could, if the codes were broken, compromise the entire SOE network in the region. The crossing itself, as reconstructed from later testimony, was an agonizingly tense affair. They moved at night, hiding in thickets and abandoned farmhouses during the day. Every dog's bark, every distant engine sound, was a potential harbinger of death. The air itself felt different, heavy with a new kind of menace. This was not the chaotic, partisan-contested wilderness of Croatia. This was the Reich's new territory. The economic and logistical context was visible on the ground. German military convoys rumbled along the main roads, and the presence of Hungarian gendarmerie, notorious for their brutality and anti-Semitism, was everywhere. After several days of this nerve-shredding infiltration, they reached the river. Under the cover of darkness, they crossed the final barrier and set foot on Hungarian soil. A wave of complex emotion washed over Hannah. She was home. But it was a home that had become a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Her first act on her native land was to bury her British uniform and change into civilian clothes. Aircraft woman Szenes was gone. The Hungarian girl, Aniko, had returned, armed with a secret that could kill her. The trap is sprung. Almost immediately, the mission began to unravel. The plan had been to make their way north toward Budapest, but they needed to cross the country undetected. This required a level of local support that proved fatally elusive. After a few days in hiding, the group was betrayed. The exact source of the betrayal remains a subject of historical debate, but the outcome was swift and brutal. On June 9, 1944, near the village of Kakovek, then part of Hungary, their hiding place was surrounded by Hungarian gendarmes. The human factor in this moment is critical to analyze. These were not German SS, but local Hungarian forces, men who likely knew the area intimately. They had been tipped off. The capture was a chaotic scene. When the gendarmes burst in, they found the group with the undeniable proof of their espionage, the wireless radio set. Its discovery sealed their fate. There was no plausible deniability, no hope of bluffing their way out. They were not civilians, they were enemy agents caught red-handed with military communications equipment. According to the reports of the Hungarian Ministry of the Interior, the prisoners were immediately searched. On Hannah, they found damning evidence: a British military-issue revolver and, more importantly, a map of Hungary with military installations marked. The poet, the pioneer, the paratrooper, was now a prisoner of war and a spy, captured on the soil of her birth nation, which was now a puppet of the Third Reich. The initial phase of interrogation began on the spot, brutal, unsystematic, and fueled by the captor's excitement at having caught a high-value target. Hannah Szenes' brief period of freedom in her homeland had lasted less than a week. The gates of hell were opening. The citadel of torture. Hannah and her comrades were transported under heavy guard from the countryside to the city of Szombathely, and from there, to the most feared address in Budapest, the FOUTK prison, the headquarters of the Hungarian military counterintelligence. This was no ordinary jail. It was a specialized facility for political prisoners and spies, a place where the rule of law was a distant memory. She was handed over to the Hungarian authorities, but the presence of the Gestapo loomed over everything. The Germans were keenly interested in this group of Palestinian Jewish paratroopers, seeing them as part of a wider conspiracy. Hannah's interrogation began immediately, and it was methodical and savage. Her interrogators had two primary objectives. First, they wanted the codes for the wireless radio. Breaking the SOE's cipher system would be a massive intelligence coup, allowing them to intercept Allied communications and potentially feed back disinformation through a captured radio. a tactic the Germans called Funkspiel, or radio game. Second, they wanted the names of other agents, local contacts, and the details of her mission. Hannah's response, as pieced together from later depositions and the horrified accounts of other prisoners who overheard the sessions, was one of astonishing defiance. She readily admitted to being a British soldier on a mission. This was a calculated tactic. By claiming status as a uniformed combatant, she was attempting to gain the protections of the Geneva Convention as a prisoner of war, a vain hope but her only legal defense. However, on the two crucial points, she was immovable. She refused, under any circumstances, to divulge the radio codes or the nature of her mission. The interrogators responded with escalating brutality. Our analysis of Gestapo and Hungarian counterintelligence methods shows a standard playbook: sleep deprivation, starvation, beatings with rubber truncheons and fists, and psychological torment. They tied her to a chair, beat her for hours, knocked out her teeth, and tore out her hair. Throughout this ordeal, her sole focus was on protecting the mission and the lives of those not yet caught. The poet's spirit, which had once sought to capture beauty in words, was now an unbreakable fortress of will, absorbing unimaginable pain in a contest for secrets. The unbearable choice. When physical torture failed to break her, her captors deployed their most cruel and devastating weapon, her mother. Hannah Szenes had, until this point, been living in Budapest, protected from the mass deportations of provincial Jews by the relative chaos of the capital and the sheer scale of the Nazi operation. The Hungarian authorities, using the address found in Hannah's belongings, located and arrested her. They brought the frail, bewildered woman to the WWII prison and threw her into a cell opposite her daughters. The strategy was diabolically simple. They staged a confrontation, forcing Hannah to see her daughter's bruised and battered state. Then they delivered the ultimatum to Hannah: give them the radio codes, or they would torture and deport her mother to Auschwitz. This is the central, agonizing pivot of the Hannah Szenes story. It transcends military strategy and enters the realm of elemental human tragedy. All her motivations, the Zionist ideal, the pioneer spirit, the military mission, had converged on a single point: the rescue of her mother. Now, the mission itself demanded she sacrifice her mother to protect the operational security of the SOE network. Archival evidence of this moment is, by its nature, indirect, drawn from Hannah Szenes' own post-war testimony. She recalled her daughter's gaze from across the prison corridor, not of despair, but of love and a terrible resolve. Hannah understood the choice before her. To save her mother would mean betraying the mission and everyone connected to it. To protect the mission meant condemning her mother. In that moment of impossible choice, Hannah Szenes the daughter ceased to exist, and Hannah Szenes the soldier made the only decision she could. She looked at her mother, a silent communication of love and farewell passing between them, and refused to speak. She chose the mission. The interrogators, enraged and perhaps even shocked by her fortitude, made good on their threat and sent Hannah Szenes to the Kastarza concentration camp, a transit point for Auschwitz. Hannah was left alone, having endured the ultimate test and made the ultimate sacrifice. The show trial. After months of brutal but fruitless interrogation, the Hungarian authorities, under intense German pressure, decided to put Hannah Szenes on trial for treason. The legal framework was a mockery of justice. As she had been captured in a Hungarian uniform, her civilian clothes, but was an officer in an enemy army, the British WWII, and was a Hungarian citizen by birth, they chose to charge her under their most severe military laws. The trial convened on October 28, 1944, before a secret military tribunal. The strategic context of this moment is vital. By late October 1944, the war had turned decisively against the Axis. The Red Army was already deep into eastern Hungary, and the siege of Budapest was imminent. The Horthy regime had been overthrown in a Nazi-backed coup, replaced by the fanatical Arrow Cross Party, whose reign of terror saw thousands of Budapest's remaining Jews murdered on the banks of the Danube. The city was descending into chaos, a maelstrom of fear, violence, and collapsing authority. Into this Götterdämmerung walked Hannah Szenes. She was a shadow of her former self, emaciated and bearing the physical scars of her torture, but her spirit was undimmed. The trial itself was a piece of theater. Her court-appointed lawyer, Dr. Andres Simon, was given little time to prepare and was essentially powerless. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Hannah, however, saw the courtroom not as a place of judgment, but as a final stage. Speaking in flawless Hungarian, she transformed her defense into an indictment of her accusers. Our archival analysis, based on Dr. Simon's post-war recollections, reconstructs her powerful testimony. She did not deny her actions. Instead, she explained them. She spoke of the Allied cause, of the fight against Nazism, and of her mission to save her fellow Jews from a murderous regime that had forfeited any claim to her loyalty. She stood not as a traitor to Hungary, but as a proud Jewish woman and a soldier fighting a just war. Her defiance stunned the military judges. They were accustomed to broken, terrified prisoners, not an articulate, unyielding accuser. Unable to reach an immediate verdict in the face of her powerful testimony and the rapidly deteriorating military situation, they postponed the judgment for 8 days. It was a brief, final reprieve. The condemned cell. Hannah was returned to her cell, her fate hanging in the balance. The days that followed were a testament to her unyielding spirit. Prisoners in adjacent cells would later testify to hearing her singing and reciting poetry. She managed to establish communication with them, tapping messages on the walls and even using a small mirror flashed out of her window to communicate with prisoners across the courtyard. She was no longer an operative with a specific military task. She had become a source of moral strength for all those trapped with her in the darkness of WWII prison. This human factor, her ability to inspire hope in the most hopeless of situations, is a recurring theme in her biographical analysis. It was in this final period that she wrote her last poems, scribbled on scraps of paper and passed secretly to other inmates. One of them contained the chillingly prescient lines, 1, 2, 3, 8 feet long / 2 strides across, the rest is dark, / I am a captive. This is my cell, / I wonder, will I live or die? Meanwhile, a desperate effort was underway to save her. Her mother, Catalin, had been unexpectedly released from the Kostarka camp through the intervention of a well-connected relative, a small miracle in the midst of the Holocaust. Now free, she worked frantically, appealing to influential figures and retaining a new lawyer to petition for a formal appeal. The legal and logistical context was nightmarish. The government was in chaos, communications were breaking down, and the advancing Soviet artillery could be heard rumbling in the distance. The very fabric of the Hungarian state was disintegrating. This chaos, ironically, was both a source of hope and of extreme danger. A functioning bureaucracy might have followed procedure, allowing for an appeal. A collapsing one was unpredictable, prone to panic and summary action. Hannah was caught in the gears of this collapsing machine. The final morning. On the morning of November 7, 1944, the indecision of the military tribunal was rendered moot by an act of brutal expediency. A military officer, Captain Ulla Simon, entered Hannah's cell. He informed her that the court had found her guilty of treason and had sentenced her to death. There would be no appeal. The execution would be carried out immediately. The Arrow Cross regime, with the Red Army at the gates, had no time for legal niceties. They wanted to eliminate inconvenient prisoners. Her reaction, as recorded in the few available eyewitness accounts and relayed later by her mother, was one of extraordinary calm and dignity. She was offered the choice of pleading for mercy. She refused. She was asked if she wanted a blindfold. She refused. Her final request was to write 2 last letters. One was to her fellow prisoners, a message of encouragement. The other was a final, heart-rending note to her mother. This letter, a priceless archival artifact, is a testament to her love and her unwavering conviction. It read, in part, "Dearest Mother, I don't know what to say. 1, 2, a million thanks. Forgive me, if you can. Go on living. I embrace you a million times. Your loving daughter." There was no apology for her actions, only for the pain it would cause. She had looked into the abyss and made her choice months earlier when she sacrificed her mother's safety for the mission. This was merely the final consequence of that decision. She had reconciled herself to her fate, and now she would face it on her own terms. The poet who had blessed the match consumed in kindling a flame was about to become that flame. The firing squad. Hannah Szenes was led from her cell into the bleak, walled courtyard of the prison. A firing squad of Hungarian soldiers was waiting. The date is significant, November 7, 1944. It was the 27th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, a day of symbolic importance for the advancing Soviets who were now her unknowing avengers. The officers present were unnerved by her composure. The standard procedure for executions was a well-oiled routine designed for efficiency and emotional detachment. The prisoner was typically blindfolded and tied to a post. Hannah shattered this routine. She refused the blindfold, her eyes open and fixed upon her executioners. She refused to be tied to the post, choosing to stand freely. This final act of defiance is perhaps the most powerful image in her entire story. It was a complete reclamation of her agency. They could take her life, but they could not take her will. She was not a passive victim being led to slaughter, she was a soldier facing the enemy. By looking them in the eye, she forced them to confront the humanity of the person they were about to kill. The tactical and psychological impact on the firing squad cannot be understated. They were not shooting a faceless traitor, they were shooting a young, unarmed woman who met their gaze without flinching. The commanding officer gave the order. A volley of rifle fire echoed in the cold November air. Hannah Szenes fell to the ground. She was 23 years old. Her mission, in military terms, had been a failure. She had not established a long-term intelligence network, nor had she organized a mass rescue. But her ultimate impact transcended the narrow definitions of military success. Echoes in eternity. The story of Hannah Szenes did not end in the prison courtyard. Her death transformed her from an SOE operative into a national symbol. After the war, her remains were recovered. In 1950, in a solemn state ceremony, her coffin was brought to the newly founded State of Israel. It was carried through the streets of cities and past the kibbutzim she had known, an echo of a royal procession for a fallen queen. She was interred in the military cemetery on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, the final resting place of Israel's heroes and leaders. Her mother, Catalin, who had survived the war, was there to witness it, a final, heartbreaking reunion. The comprehensive analysis of Hannah's legacy reveals a multi-layered impact. For the State of Israel, she became a foundational myth, a symbol of the new Jew, the courageous diaspora Jew who returned to fight for their people, a stark contrast to the perceived passivity of Holocaust victims. Her poems, particularly Eli, Eli, my God, and Blessed is the Match, became part of the nation's cultural canon, sung by schoolchildren and soldiers alike, their emotional power undiminished by time. From a military history perspective, her mission highlights the complexities and often tragic outcomes of special operations, where individual courage can be overwhelmed by strategic realities. It underscores the clash between the pragmatic goals of military command, the SOE, and the desperate, idealistic aims of a people facing genocide, the Yishuv. But ultimately, the archival record of Hannah Szenes is a human story. It is the story of a poet forced to become a warrior, of a daughter who made an impossible choice, and of an individual who, in the face of absolute evil, chose to be the flame rather than curse the darkness. Her mission did not turn the tide of the war, but it left behind a legacy of courage that continues to illuminate the darkest corners of human history.